Contemplative Outreach is celebrating our 10th anniversary this year. We are delighted to have with us the founders of the Centering Prayer Movement, Father Basil Pennington, Father William Menninger, and of course the founder of Contemplative Outreach, Father Thomas Keating.
Let me just remind you of the historical background in which this prayer began to evolve. We're talking about the late 60s, early 70s, when a great many young people and not so young people were heading east or turning east, a process that many people still do, to find in other traditions what was essentially they found missing in their parish or university levels. That is a genuine Christian spirituality, a spirituality that spoke of experience, and that period kind of reflected the spiritual desert that Christianity has been in since the Reformation and perhaps before. So we were meeting there at Spencer, a lot of young people who were coming to the monastery to sort of check us out. And many of these were Catholic boys and girls or other Christians. And at least I, as the abbot of that community and dealing with some of these people as possible vocations, felt a more and more poignant kind of urge or almost an anguish coming from my own loyalties to the church and to the tradition as I had been brought up in the monastery to know it. I felt so sad that here there was this tremendous richness in the Christian tradition, and people of the most generous kind were going everywhere. They say about 10,000 young people went to India every summer looking for a guru or spirituality, and they never thought of coming to a Christian monastery, and perhaps they hadn't even heard of it yet, because the idea of a contemplative dimension to the gospel that was prominent maybe in the early centuries of the church had just gone out of practice. So I, meeting with these people, I finally asked the community one day, isn't there, had been exposed to some transcendental meditation people and also to Zen master. And so we were aware that how-to methods seem to be the way you communicate spirituality in our day and age. And these young people were expecting it, as if they said, here is the method we're using, where's yours? And there was no answer in most places, and I venture to say, still isn't in many places. Mm-hmm. This richness, so I just suggested to the community one day, couldn't we put this rich Christian tradition that we've experienced as monastics into a form that would be available for contemporary people who go for these how-to methods. And at least it was my experience that Bill Menninger picked this up and perhaps from his own experience, and he developed a method in the guest house that he was teaching.
At the time that Thomas is talking about, I was off and on, I was either guest master or retreat master, so I did see these young people who came to the monastery, some of them finally arriving at the conclusion that maybe the Catholic Church, in its monastic element at least, has something to offer in terms of what they were looking for. But my own experience, really, I would say, was dominated in a negative way by my training as a seminarian and as a parish priest, which I was for 6 years before I entered the monastery. We were given to understand implicitly and sometimes explicitly that contemplative prayer was really none of our business. It wasn't something that most of us were capable of. Perhaps if you lived long enough and retired as a Monsignor, when we were 90 or 95, we might be appointed a chaplain of the Poor Clares, and maybe we might utilize something of what the church has to offer. And with the result that we were given a course in mystical theology, I think it was an hour a week for half a semester in our last year at the seminary. And I left the seminary and practiced for 6 years as a parish priest with this in mind, that this, and I also had this very unfortunate experience that we were taught the Sulpician method, which is a particular method of discursive meditation. And we meditated every day from 6 in the morning until 6:39 or 6:29 and a half. when the bell would ring and that you came to the conclusion of your meditation. And my own experience was that I did this the first day I entered the seminary, and I did it 8 years later, the last day I was in the seminary, and there was not a moment of growth. It was the same experience, the same difficulties, and I didn't even know enough to be disappointed, but my understanding was this is what you'll be doing for the rest of your life, because nothing else was ever offered. When I entered the monastery, and as a novice, and of course we had our routine of prayer, of work, of divine office, unfortunately I did what we could only be calling, I fell into contemplative prayer. And I found myself spending more and more time in the chapel and less time reading, less and less time in thinking about what the mysteries of the faith, and actually more and more time in experience of loving God in silence. And I wasn't even then quite sure of what it was I was doing. I mentioned the matter to my novice master and to my spiritual director, and I received some negative encouragement in the sense that I don't think they were able to say, well, yes, you're doing it right and do this, or modify it here, or look at this, or read that. All they said was, yeah, that seems okay. And I wasn't tremendously happy with what was going on. And then one day, by complete accident, I saw in the corner of the library, it's probably the same book that Thomas mentioned having seen himself. It was a Middle English edition of The Cloud of Unknowing. And I devoured that because almost from the first page, I saw in it expressed in it my own personal experience. And then I began to understand what I was doing, that it was valid and legitimate, and that perhaps I was doing the right things. Then about this time, I was a monk in simple vows. I was not a fully, really pledged member of the community. I was asked by Father Thomas to be the retreat master. And having seen from these young people that came to the monastery, and from some people involved in Zen, in TM, in Hindu meditations, that actually meditation was a teachable thing, something more than discursive meditation or the Ignatian method or the Sulpician method. And I thought to myself, well, why couldn't I take that teachableness and teach contemplative prayer to parish priests who had been through the same thing I went through and was still going through it, and teach contemplative prayer through the cloud of unknowing. And so I began doing that, and we're a little in doubt, Basil, aren't we, as to the year when that was, but that's not too important. I would say like maybe the year 1974, I gave a retreat every other week to 11, so we had 11 rooms, to 11 parish priests. And so I gave about 25 retreats on contemplative prayer according to the cloud of unknowing, which was a difficult thing because I had to do a hard sell. I had to start by telling them, well, I know what your training is. I had the same training. I know what your negativity is on this. But let me tell you something, it can be taught. And I began teaching them from the cloud of unknowing.
I think the idea of a method of learning contemplative prayer or disposing oneself for the gifts of the Spirit that lead to contemplative prayer is not generally taught. And maybe it's beginning to be taught in some religious communities, but many of the communities I met in circulating around the country when I was travelable, I didn't find it. And I think it was that lack of a way of teaching it, or a method, or a kind of sapiential kind of teaching, or teaching with some kind of unction, that it seems to me is hard to find in the church from what I hear even now. Mm-hmm. And as Bill has just said, his coming upon this was from his own personal experience. So teaching presupposes some personal experience of the contemplative way, it seems to me.
And in visiting our European monasteries, and in talking, and particularly with the former Abbot General, who was an Englishman, that they were taught, as a matter of fact, they were taught contemplative prayer, and he was actually taught from the cloud of unknowing. And so when I discussed it with him, he was very comfortable with it and familiar with it. And so I'm wondering if it wasn't maybe our American houses more perhaps than other of our monasteries that were perhaps remiss in it or simply didn't understand it.
I actually learned contemplative prayer very early from my grandmother, being with her in prayer, and had been practicing contemplative prayer quite a bit before I came to the monastery. And when I came, our novice master sort of presumed we knew nothing about what they called those days mental prayer, and had a book, Dom Lahody's book, and we were supposed to begin to learn the first steps of active meditation. And I tried it a bit, and it gave me just headaches. So I went to our abbot at that time, Dom Edmund Frutter, who was a great spiritual father. And I told him my difficulties, so he asked how I prayed, and I told him how simply, and I was doing basically what the centering prayer is, but without a method, so to speak. I just sat there with the Lord and repeated his name when I needed to. So Dom Edmund confirmed that as way of prayer, and he gave me a book by Dom Bellarger, who had been abbot of Citeaux, and at that time was superior ad nudum at a little monastery off the coast of Wales.
Caldy?
Caldy. And so the book was in English, and that confirmed this way of prayer. But again, it wasn't spelled out in a simple practical method. He just talked about this way of prayer. So that's the way I was confirmed in it and continued to practice it. We had set periods in the monastery, but we had other periods we were free. I got into St. Bernard in the novitiate. I had a good Latin background, and most of the brothers didn't, and so I was translating Bernard for them. And of course, there in Bernard, I found a very rich contemplative tradition. And that led me on to the other fathers and eventually to Cistercian publications. But I was doing the weekend retreats for the lay people when Bill was doing the ones for the priests at that time. And hearing what he was doing and hearing the results of it, then I started trying to do it on the weekends. And the lay people were very responsive, very, very responsive. And it went on from there. I guess I was the first one to bring it outside the monastery in the Conference of Major Superiors of Men in 1973 or 4. Again, I'm not sure the asked I be on the Religious Life Committee with 2 others. And it was a rather interesting experience. They came to Spencer for a meeting, and one was a La Salette father and the other was a Jesuit. And we sat down, and so the La Salette father said, well, what are we going to do? And I said, I know what we're going to do. And I immediately taught the 2 of them century prayer, and we centered for 20 minutes. And as we came out, the Jesuit said, this is good, but I couldn't possibly do it. You'll have to get somebody else on the committee. Which was a great blessing, because we then invited a nun to join us, a wonderful Irish nun down in Rhode Island, Sister Kieran Flynn. And as a result then, the Leadership Conference of Religious Women then asked, could we have a joint committee? And so we began sharing centering prayer with both the men and women religious. And perhaps the most humorous thing about it was 2 years later, this good Jesuit published an article in The Way on centering prayer. And I said, how did you ever get that? He said, well, Sister Karen got me. She taught me it. And he's been practicing centering prayer ever since. A beautiful, beautiful man. But it was the first workshop I did outside the monastery for the major superiors in Rhode Island at Mercy Lodge, that the name came up. Yeah, see, William had been calling it the prayer of the cloud. Traditionally, I think it would be called the prayer of the heart. That's the way I found it in Dom Bellarger and the others. But, you know, Americans are so pragmatic. When you say heart, they immediately think of this cardiac organ and start worrying about it and how's their pacemaker going, and they don't understand the biblical sense of heart, which means the deepest sense, the source within you. But I used Merton a great deal. Again, Merton taught a lot about this prayer. And he would say things like, you know, if you really want to come to God, you go to your own center and pass through that center into the very center of God. And he used that term fairly frequently. And by the end of the workshop, one of the men on the committee, Father Armand Prue, the La Salette father, was calling a centering prayer. And so I brought that home. William was furious. He said it's very gimmicky. I think the Prayer of the Cloud was a particularly good name either. The Prayer of the Heart didn't work. Anyway, it kind of caught on, and here we are.
Prayer of the Cloud kind of suggests a psychedelic
Pretty cloudy.
experience, which we didn't want to communicate.
Yeah.
At any rate,
in that era.
we're all reconciled to centering prayer
Yeah.
as a fait accompli.
Complete, yeah.
Even I accept it.
There's a little point of
We never copyrighted it.
when you brought it back, we settled on centering prayer. We also had to settle on the issue of what posture we're going to recommend. 'Cause we had been exposed to, through this Zen teacher, to the value of the Zen posture. And I remember Basil and I conferring, well, should we have them sit in that posture or should we just sit in a chair? Well, it seemed to me that we wanted to make this available to all ages and to make it as simple as possible and just emphasize the essentials. So I couldn't see these elderly monsignors sitting in a lotus posture.
Besides the cloud, we had the cloud. What does the cloud say, William?
God says, sit easily.
Right.
So I have never had a problem with it. I would say the method came before the movement. The packaging, in a sense, was influenced by Eastern methods of meditation. Sometimes people are afraid to say this. I think always in this regard of the second century Christian apologist, St. Justin the Martyr, and he has a rather famous work called A Dialogue with Trypho the Jew. Trypho was a rabbi, and Justin came to Christianity, to a belief in God, through his study of Plato and Aristotle. And Trypho accused him of egregious error. He said to him, well, you can't come to God through Plato and Aristotle. You can only come to God through Abraham and Moses. And Trypho said, no, that's not so. I'm a Christian, and as a Christian, every truth belongs to me. And so he justified coming to God through the Greek pagan philosophers. So I have no hesitation or no apologies in taking whatever truths we can take. And as a matter of fact, Thomas could probably say more about this than I could, and Basil too, that we were asked by the Vatican to get involved in dialogue with Eastern meditation and with Eastern monasticism as the area in which Christianity had the most common basis. So I saw the teaching of the cloud as very much viable in terms of several methods of Eastern meditation, the packaging, as it were. And the result of that was my teaching the cloud in the terms of what I refer to as 3 rules. Thomas doesn't allow me to call them rules because he says people don't like rules. Call them suggestions or norms or what? Guidelines is what he loves. I still call them rules. And the 3 rules basically, most people are familiar with. The first one is and I know Basil has his own expression of them, and so does Thomas, but as I use them and still use them, you begin your meditation, your contemplative meditation, with a half-minute act of faith, and you conclude with a 2-minute Our Father. And then the second one is that you choose a prayer word, which represents for you the fullness of your love for God, and you listen to that prayer word. And then the third one is when you find that you have ceased your prayer word, you just say to yourself, I will go back to my prayer word. It's interesting because when I started, there was only one rule. And the one rule, the one guideline was choose a word prayer from the cloud that represents for you the fullness of your love for God, and listen to that prayer. After doing it for a few months, I thought, well, maybe we'd better have another one, and I introduced the first one about beginning with faith and ending with an Our Father. And then I decided we needed a third one, and that was dealing with distractions. So at this point I said to myself, well, this is getting too confusing. There will be no further guidelines. Well, now actually I teach it in the form of 3 guidelines and a footnote.
The cloud says, as William told us this morning, it says this isn't the only way. There are many ways people come to contemplative prayer. But even within this way, people can come at a certain... Now, Tom has been free, since he retired from the abbatial office, in 81 to devote himself completely to this, and he's reached out to some of the wonderful findings of modern science and so on, and integrated those, which is extremely important for the church, but also for the enrichment of this. And his work is tremendous. I tend to be more of a popularizer and simply teach. I keep it down to 3 rules, very much so. And I depend a lot more from the Gospels to bring it right out of the Gospels. And I sometimes feel like I'm sort of a Johnny Appleseed spreading the seed abroad. But then I tell them they need follow-up, and follow-up can be best found with the contemplative outreach and with the work that Tom is doing. See, William has always been more fully researched in the cloud of a knowing, and that sort of funnel of the tradition. I have not used the cloud much because I find it somewhat difficult to read and so on, and have simply gone back to gospel pericopes and drawn it out of the Gospels. And I try to keep it very, very simple. But then in the course of the dialogue workshops, things will come up, and I use Thomas's stuff a great deal to answer them.
Thomas especially, I think he has to be given credit, because with Thomas it's not, with Basil and with myself too, I simply teach workshops on the cloud of unknowing, on contemplative prayer according to the cloud of unknowing. But Thomas goes far beyond that and has actually developed a whole spirituality and whole lifestyle that centers on this and stems from it. And so I do the same as Basil. I sort of, if he's Johnny Appleseed, I'm John the Baptist. I go to prepare the way before him and to level the mountains and fill the valleys. But I do try as often as I give these, and I give them fairly often, these retreats, to then have them in some way or other attach themselves and get in contact with contemplative outreach.
Well, I think that the contribution that I made was again very experiential. When I left Spencer and retired as abbot there, and came to St. Benedict's Monastery in Snowmass, I didn't have a lot to do. I was guest master there and general cleanser of the guest house facilities, and
Nice way of saying you clean the jakes.
well, but I had no intention of teaching centering prayer, because I thought Basil was quite doing a great job and more than adequate. And I wasn't aware of the pervasiveness of this hunger for a deeper spirituality that was experienced especially by lay people. And so I gave this little talk at the request of the local pastor in a little town called Basalt, and he advertised it with one sentence in the parish bulletin, and about 80 folks showed up, and I taught it one night for 4 weeks.
You have to consider this in a place that was less than 10% Catholic.
Mm-hmm. Yes, many of the people were not Catholics, but had been into some other thing. And I noticed an amazement in the part of those who were Catholics that there existed a contemplative process or method in the Catholic Church, and it completely changed their negativity towards the Church in many cases. So I feel that I kind of got back into this ministry as far as going out of the monastery, and at least twice I consulted with the community as to whether this was harmful, because there's a very strong sense in the monastic community of solitude, of separation from the world, and so on. But people seem to feel that it was a genuine call from God, and even the novices supported it, who are usually more strict than the seniors. In any case, what can you do with a resigned abbot? The best thing is let him do what he wants, I think, or what he thinks he should be doing. So then I gradually began to we had this, I wanted to try, again, following what Bill said, we were inspired by the packaging of the East. I would want to emphasize that we were not inspired by the theological content, but we were influenced by the practical way in which these Eastern teachers were able to reach students in great numbers, with great effect, and with the teaching that was fairly comprehensive and admirable. There's no question that the psychological wisdom of the Eastern traditions are really, at least at this stage in the Christian development, are superior as far as their their way that it's organized and communicated, at least so it seems to me. At least they're hard to compete with, if that's the right word. And we were trying to present something, I think all three of us, that would be an alternative for people going to the East, as was happening in great numbers, because we were all aware of this Reach tradition, and each of us was trying to make it available as we had experienced it and as we had studied this material. And I found not only in the Cloud, but in some of the other masters, at least in incipient methods, like in John Cashin, it seems to me there's a very primitive method of centering prayer given there. They're in the hesychasts of the Assyrian monks and that whole tradition in Eastern monasticism, and then in the Orthodox tradition. But then in John of the Cross, I was greatly inspired by the living flame of love, in which there's a long digression. I think it's third stanza, 26 to 52 or something, numbers, where he describes the kind of conduct the prayer should impose upon himself or herself when they're moving or called by God from discursive meditation to contemplation. And there's an awful lot of very practical teaching there, and advice, incidentally, for spiritual directors as to how to handle people in that very crucial transitional stage in which people either go through the pains of the dark night of sense, or they give up prayer because they don't realize that this is an actual act of God's tremendous
Doesn't he cover
tenderness.
that also in the Ascent to Mount Carmel?
Yes, he covers it
the three
again there.
criteria by which you know you go from
Well, I
discursive
wasn't thinking so
meditation to
much of the
contemplative.
signs, which are crucial, but actually his advice is very experiential. And in other words, he says, when you're in this waiting lovingly upon God, the soul should do nothing at all except to wait lovingly with the general loving intention on God. Well, he doesn't suggest using a prayer word, actually, to support that. What he does is says, when there are other thoughts, that one turns ever so gently to the divine presence as if you were looking at someone you loved. So in other words, instead of using a listening passage into the spiritual level of our being, or cultivating the true self in that form, he suggests another kind of process, which is not a visual image, but a visual analogy. And this I've found works better for a number of people who, because they're artistic or otherwise, are actually visually orientated. And it is hard to teach this because people will think, well, use some image, and they start thinking of God with a beard or the cross or something. And that's not what he means. He simply means it's one's heart, inner being, the will sort of turns towards God as if, so it's an analogy of the sense of sight. You don't see anything, but it's a movement of consent and of love. And so I've incorporated that possibility as an alternative to the word, while following the same guidelines for both whether you're using a word and incidentally, I think there's a third way that can be used, namely to follow the breathing, not as with attention, but simply noticing that one is breathing and identifying this with the pouring out of the Spirit into our hearts, and maybe breathing forth the love into the world, or some such image. So what I would say has happened is that as we have a stable group of people doing this practice, and this is something that's been possible for us since we have a base at the community in Snowmass, which not every monastery provides, where people can come. You're meeting the same people, and it was this experience of the value of that prompted me to think of a network that would support those. It really started, I should say, I think, by an experiment that I tried. I had attended a number of Zen sesshin when the Rashi came to Spencer for a number of years during the 80s. And so I always wondered, what would be the effects of that much meditation or prayer, meditation in the contemplative sense, not discursive meditation, if we had an event in which we actually had 6 or 7 hours of prayer every day, plus input, plus a certain simplicity of lifestyle that would pull people out of their usual routines. So by chance, I had visited the Lama Foundation in New Mexico and had talked there and was invited to come back for their intensive, they had an area that they had intensive retreats in Sufism and Islam, and other teachers came there. So in 1984, in this late summer, I invited a certain number of people, I think there were 11 or 12, to join me there. And so that was 2 weeks long. And it's there that I developed the conceptual background for the way I teach centering prayer, which uses a lot of psychological material as a vehicle for expressing the traditional spiritual life. I have been finding, maybe it's not the experience of the others here, that modern people, especially lay people who are not familiar with the tradition, shy away from the traditional terms, the traditional ascetical, mystical terminology. And so I see psychology, if it's properly understood and used, as a kind of handmaid to the spiritual life today, the way we used to speak of philosophy as the handmaid of theology. I think it's a question of what's the street language today for spirituality, and I think it has to be presented in some psychological terminology or with some relation to that field. Well, anyway, the main thing, though, with the retreat was the experiment in 6 hours a day of approximately of centering prayer, and I found the same results, the same experience of depth or of meaning or of enthusiasm that I had heard in the Zen retreats that I had experienced, and that convinced me that it could be done. But it was a whole year before we had another one there, and one of the members in that retreat urged me to start something in New York, and someone else had a little had space in the bottom of a parish house in New York City, and we were received by the cardinal there, Cardinal O'Connor, and so we started there, and it's just kind of grown from that place. But the predominant people, we've had some great priests and religious helping us, but the constituency is basically lay persons, and I more and more felt convinced that the lay people have no opposition to this. They don't have a preconceived ideas, they don't have a preliminary training, some of which they have to forget in order to practice contemplative prayer with ease, as Bill suggested. So that's what, so I made the conclusion that from the point of view of time, the people who are most interested in receiving this renewal of the contemplative tradition were lay persons, and it would be better to direct our energies towards them, while I used every opportunity I could, and our organization, others in it, give retreats to priests and in parishes and in religious life. So it's not that we exclude religious life, it's just that we found, well, there are more lay people. And indeed, it should be said that the ones who take to it perhaps most quickly are women. And that may be because contemplative prayer addresses the instinctual need to control and to have power, at least over one's own spiritual life, that is over anything. God, if you could get away with it, that seems to be especially entrenched in men in our culture.
And the intuitive element in contemplative prayer is feminine, I think, as is the wisdom element, which is really the on the will side rather than the intellect side. I think is a feminine phenomenon in men or women. But Thomas, some observations in regard to the organizational setup in COC as a lay movement. I'd rather call it a non-clerical movement because it includes priests, nuns, and lay people. But the Cloud of Unknowing is addressed to Dear Friend of God. And during the 14th century, there was a strong movement in the Low Countries and in Germany and in England of lay people who were oriented toward the contemplative life, who called themselves the Friends of God. And there was also the Begards and the Beguines, who were lay people, actually. It was not a religious group. This was a very, very strong movement. The difference between this and what you're doing, of course, is this was an anti-intellectual movement. And they were more, as the imitation of Christ was part of that. You know, I'd rather experience compunction than know how to define it. But as I was reading this, and I was saying to myself, well, I wonder what a group like that would be like today. And all of a sudden it came to me, my God, this is what Thomas is doing. This is contemplative outreach. It's a group of non-clerical but lay people plus religious and priests who are organized and even with a certain, now with some communal basis and supporting one another in contemplative prayer. And it really is, I think, Thomas, really a 20th century reenactment in the very best sense of the atmosphere that created the cloud of unknowing.
Nothing new, just old stuff.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's not New Age, let's put it that way.
I'd like to add something here, though, too. While there is a tremendous evolution going on in the church society, and the institutions are going to go through quite a change, I think, and the clerical role is going to be lessened. Still, I think we face the reality in our Roman Catholic Church and most of the central churches that the clerical leadership is extremely important, and the lay people are not going to get very far without some support there. And that's why I feel very strongly we also have to reach out to the clerical leadership. And that's why I started the Mastery Foundation, which has its particular courses directed to those whose lives are about sacred ministry. They're the toughest group. I can see why you'd be glad to go to the lay people. And it's also a place where, incidentally, we've met the New Age movement a great deal because we've kind of integrated some of their ideas. Again, your idea, as Paul says, all things are ours and we are Christ and Christ is God's. And we got criticized a great deal for that. But we've used some of those processes to break the clergy open, to be available to the contemplative dimension. And it's very ecumenical. It goes through all the church and even to the Jewish community. And we have a rabbi as the vice president of it. So we're doing the same thing there in a very different approach, trying to get to another segment. But this is for everybody. You know, it can't just be a lay movement. And we've really got to work hard at bringing the clergy along.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. It's just that if you found that way of reaching them, they have a previous training that is sometimes not helpful, as Bill suggested.
Absolutely.
And they're so terribly busy nowadays. Yeah. I think everybody should be concerned with the fate of parish priests today because they're so overworked and their numbers are going down. And they really don't have time to come to a workshop. Many pastors have opened themselves to welcoming a centering prayer group in the parish, but they don't themselves come because they don't have time.
That's where you set your priorities. How about getting something good going for the seminarians, though?
Well, we've tried to do that in one or two seminaries, but again, the academic level is so demanding that they don't have much time, and it's easy to lose without follow-up. That's really why we started this networking process, and I assure you that it doesn't work that well in most cases, because when you give an introductory workshop, like you say, you have, say, 100 people come. If 30 people sign up for a follow-up, I think it's a success. And that means that after, you have to have some kind of program to which they can come. And if you do, then you're, of that 30%, your percentage of those who persevere are much higher. And then you need programs, different kind of workshops graded to their development that they can, because once people are on this journey, they always want more. And that's one of our problems right now, because now there's some who advanced far enough that we don't have the next level in place where they can go and find a community of people who are experiencing, you know, the dark nights at a deep level and who are perhaps moving on to various experiences of divine union. These people also need help. We're trying to develop spiritual direction.
30 years ago, it would be unheard of for even a nun to presume to teach prayer. I mean, out of the 3rd grade, that would be okay. But you know, to offer herself as a spiritual guide, a spiritual director, and now, God forbid, we're even gone beyond nuns to lay people who are actually teaching prayer.
And teaching bishops and priests.
Yes, and it's absolutely marvelous to see this going on, and people doing this with confidence and with experience and sharing that. I think it's one of the greatest things to come out of centering and to come out of COC.
Yeah, we have a strong group in Manila, in the Philippines.
Very strong, yeah.
And Lita Salinas teaches priests, seminarians, and Grace, who's her coordinator, who works with her, she goes into the Carmelite convents and the Poor Clares and shares this with them. In other words, it's not that we're trying to teach, or still less to say, that these contemplative communities of women are not contemplative. It's just that the centering prayer is kind of crystallizes what they're doing, or explains to them what they're doing, and gives them a certain encouragement or a certain regularity or order into what they're doing, so that hopefully they can advance more easily into the depths of the contemplative dimension of the gospel.
But you know, Basil, when you mentioned your mastery organization and the importance of having the clergy as you know, being the area where the breakthrough is, Thomas really does this. You know, in the talks that he's had with us to support him in his work with COC, his great emphasis is on having a monastery, the monastery of Snowmass, as a central place whence this will come from and to which people will come to receive this. So you actually do use that, Thomas, don't you? That,
Oh, sure.
You know, the idea of it coming from the monastic milieu.
Yeah, I think, you know, our present facilities at Snowmass are pretty down at the heel.
Yeah, and this
So when we
reminds
get a
us that
new-
we're trying to raise another $500,000 for our new retreat house. We have 2.5, and we need another 500,000.
Okay, enough on the...
We think the priests would be more interested in coming when there's some fairly decent
The
facilities.
ministers are much more open, I think, than priests, too, maybe because they've had less formation, deformation in spirituality. But I have found the Episcopal clergy especially, but of the many different ones, very responsive. And I would say a good half of what I do is sponsored by Protestant groups now. Certainly in South Africa.
It's certainly clear that our Protestant brethren are getting the idea that there's something missing in their tradition. They feel this, and so but there are certain movements within those traditions, like in the Methodists have that house in Nashville, isn't it?
Yes.
I forget the name of it.
Well, no,
The Shalem Institute in Washington
Shalem
is very,
is
very
the-
active Episcopal church.
talk I'm giving in Denver at the Episcopal Cathedral. They're expecting 600 people.
Yeah, well, we
talk
kind
on
of
the cloud.
we share a facility with an Episcopal contemplative community in Denver, which is associated with the cathedral there. So we're able to use all those facilities. It's a great help to us, and we plan events there. The Bishop of Denver, Episcopal Bishop of Denver, is very sympathetic to this. So I think there are there's a lot of leadership people in the other traditions who feel that there's something missing in their tradition, and it's precisely the contemplative dimension. And I think it's been missing in our tradition until recently, and since the Second Vatican Council, there's been a number of initiatives, part of different orders and different people, to bring it back. And so we're just part of that tide that is kind of moving into the Christian church, that I think is really inspired by the Spirit, and so we just try to follow that. I was just going to say that there's a tremendous advantage in having a stable group of people that you can contact doing this prayer, and that has become the case in contemplative outreach. So that we don't really plan, we don't organize, we don't structure anything first, but we have different bodies of consultation consisting of people who are advancing in this process. And the Spirit seems to inspire them with what our next steps should be, or what is missing in the program. And so by listening to what the Spirit is saying in the people, we have been able to address those needs a little bit anyway. And if we had more help, but most of our workers are volunteers, so they have other duties, professional, family, and so on. So they can only do this as something extra. So they're tremendously generous, and when you consider that as we present centering prayer, it's a way of life, and it involves an active kind of contemplative practices, as well as the fairly passive but alert attention that we give during prayer, so that it really invites people to a whole way of life, of leading the contemplative dimension of the gospel in modern times. And that's how we try to gear all of the stuff that we present, is make it available to people where they are,